Coming up on Why Should I Trust You? What if one of the biggest public health debates of the next decade isn't about vaccines or Ozempic or chronic disease? What if it's about air conditioning? The world's temperatures are getting dangerously warmer, and there's a debate underway over whether air conditioning is a public health necessity or whether an over-reliance on it will only deepen the climate crisis. Europe is the world's fastest warming continent, with estimates that this summer, the heat there contributed to 10,000 to 14,000 deaths over just a few weeks. The United States suffers deadly heat waves too, but Europe experiences much higher heat wave-related death tolls. One major difference people are pointing to: air conditioning. Americans have a lot more of it than Europeans do. Defenders of Europe's lower use of air conditioning argue that simply installing more AC isn't the answer. Critics say this has gone too far. Too many people are dying. Just get air conditioning already. But beneath this debate are some very big questions. What do we owe one another in a warming world? What does adaptation mean and look like? And who bears the costs when our solutions create new problems? We have a blockbuster lineup today who've all been thinking a lot about this. Economist and popular blogger Noah Smith, The Atlantic's Thomas Chatterton-Williams, and New York Times columnist David Wallace-Wells. Let's get started. Hey everyone, welcome to the show. It's just me and Maggie today. Hi, Mags.
Hey.
Tom and Dr. Mark are off today. I'm your host, Brenda Adhikari.
And I'm Maggie Bartlett.
And you're listening to Why Should I Trust You, a weekly podcast exploring the breakdown in trust around mainstream science, medicine, public health, and AI. And through weekly conversations featuring diverse perspectives, we hope to learn what, if anything, we can do about it.
Yeah, and as always, you can email us, as many of you do. And we do love this. We read every single one. So reach us at questions@whyshoulditrustyou.net. And please take a minute, subscribe, follow the podcast, leave us a rating, a review. It does really help us.
Yeah. So look, I know what you're thinking. Like, in the grand scheme of things in the world, you're talking about air conditioning? What? Honestly, though, it makes perfect sense. Heat waves create a lot of deaths in this world. And the truth is that this is a conversation that's kind of erupted over the last couple of months because of the heat waves in Europe. And today we have an incredible lineup of guests. I'm a huge fan of all of them. Noah Smith, Thomas Chatterton-Williams, and David Wallace-Wells. They've all been writing about what has become one of the most surprisingly contentious debates of the summer. But let's get some background. So if you were in parts of Europe this summer, you were experiencing temperatures above 107 degrees. And yet in many European countries, air conditioning remains far less common than it is here in the United States. So just for some perspective, in the US, roughly 90% of households have air conditioning. And in many parts of Europe, that number is closer to 20%. When I saw that, Maggie, I was like,
yeah,
that is a big difference. Now, before we make this all about air conditioning, there's a lot more going on. Europe has an older population than the United States. About 1 in 5 Europeans are over the age of 65, compared with about 1 in 6 Americans. And age is one of the biggest predictors of who dies during extreme heat. Now, Europe also has older housing that wasn't designed for prolonged heat, and many cities that historically didn't need to adapt to the kinds of temperatures that they're now experiencing. But access to cooling is one important difference.
Yeah, and I think it sounds simple, but if every country responded to our hotter planet by installing billions more air conditioners, there's another question. Can our electrical grids handle that demand? And if that electricity comes from fossil fuels, does it create a cycle where a hotter planet leads to more AC use, to more energy demand, to more emissions, and ultimately more warming? The International Energy Agency has warned that air conditioning is one of the fastest growing sources of electricity demand worldwide, and that could be a huge problem.
Right. So look, those are some of the big questions we're bringing into today's conversation. Is air conditioning becoming as essential to public health as clean drinking water and electricity? Or are we asking the wrong question altogether? Should we be talking less about air conditioners and more about our values and about how we want to live in a much hotter world? So coming up next, we're going to get into all this with Noah Smith, Thomas Chatterton-Williams, and David Wallace-Wells. We'll be right back. Why Should I Trust You? Welcome to our guests. Noah Smith is an economist, writer, and publisher of the widely read Substack No Opinion. He's a former professor of finance who was a Bloomberg opinion columnist, and he now writes about economics, technology, industrial policy, and the future of growth. Welcome to the show, Noah.
Hey, thanks for having me on.
Thomas Chatterton Williams is a staff writer at The Atlantic and the author of several books, including Self-Portrait in Black and White and Summer of Our Discontent. His work explores race, identity, free expression, and the state of American culture. He also lives in France half the year, so I think he's quite familiar with the European heat waves. Thomas, great to have you.
Good to be here. Thank you.
And finally, David Wallace Wells, who is no stranger to the show. He is a New York Times columnist covering climate change, science, and technology. He's also the author of the #1 bestseller, The Uninhabitable Earth, Life After Warming. David, welcome back.
Hey, great to be here.
Okay, glad to have you all on. So look, I've been calling this the great air conditioning debate, but the more I read all three of you, the more I realize this isn't really about air conditioning. It seems to really be a debate about values. What do we owe people living through a hotter world today? And what do we owe future generations who will live with the consequences of the choices we make? So Noah, let's start with you. Back in June, you republished an essay titled Europe's Resistance to AC is Driving It Insane. And then you apparently posted this little piece of poetry on X where you wrote, quote, just install the goddamn fucking AC and save your grandma's life, Euro friends. So make the case. Why do you think Europe is getting this so wrong?
Well, I think the main reason is that the world is changing very fast. And there is an understandable impulse in many parts of the world to say, stop the bus. I'd like to get off. I just want things to be the way they always were. And you see this in America with data centers. People are afraid of the AI future, and so they attack data centers in their local neighborhood, not because banning a data center in upstate New York can slow the march of AI, but because it's the only thing they can do. It's what they know how to do. They're using the tools at hand, which is local NIMBYism. They're using that tool to sort of kick out against the future. And I think that we're seeing a lot of the same kind of things in a lot of different societies manifest in different ways. And I think, I could go off on a whole tangent about why the future feels like it's accelerating. It's partly due to technology, but it's partly due to the availability heuristic of social media. Everything seems different because we're getting everything shoved in our face. But I think that in Europe, Europe was a cold place. They didn't need AC. Global warming happened. Now they do need AC in almost all of Europe. And that's a change, right? You need this thing that you didn't need before. And, I think people are just sort of kicking against that change. I think that's just a big part of it. Obviously, people come up with all kinds of, AC, releases a bunch of carbon, so you're actually hurting the climate, blah, blah, blah. I mean, like that's true to a very tiny degree. But overall, it's not a big deal. But people, AC doesn't work with the architecture of our buildings, of our beautiful buildings in Europe, or, actually, did you know that AC just relocates heat? It doesn't actually eliminate heat, and therefore using AC cannot actually cool a city is the most hilarious one that I've seen. And then there's just a bunch of, NIMBYist procedural, like you can't install AC because our housing council hasn't, in UK. And so you just see the massive multiplicity and variety of the anti-AC arguments that you see just popping up everywhere in Europe makes me think the real thing is something deeper. It's not none of these things. I mean, maybe people think these things, but the real thing that's going on is this instinctive fear of change, the fear that now things will have to change.
Okay, we're going to come back and address some of the things you said, and I want to get a good, juicy conversation going with all three of you, but just to kind of get you each in here. So, Thomas, on the very same day that Noah reposted his article, you wrote an essay for The Atlantic titled The Overlooked Reason Europe Doesn't Have AC. And you argued that Americans and Europeans have fundamentally different ideas about comfort and suffering and sacrifice, and you spend half the year living in France. I mean, what do you think we Americans misunderstand about the European perspective here?
Yeah, I mean, I find it fascinating to be between the two societies. The question that intrigues me most is not whether Europe is getting warmer or not. It clearly is getting warmer, but the question is, what constitutes an acceptable level of discomfort or suffering, and how do you approach life more broadly? I just got back from Dallas, where it reached a couple weeks ago, it reached 116 degrees. That's what it felt like on the ground. It was unbelievable. I've never felt heat like that before. But actually, you were quickly extraordinarily uncomfortable from the cold. When you would walk into immediately the lobby of a building or get into an Uber, you needed to have a sweater. And it was a kind of very different experience than being in the south of France, where I am right now, where it gets very hot, but people really don't engineer the environment so thoroughly to change what the temperature feels like. Even the air conditioning that's on in this house that I'm sitting in, it's quite moderate. It doesn't bring it down to 68 degrees. It's just cooler than it is outside. And so I don't know if there's a right or wrong answer, but I'm intrigued by the way that Americans approach life compared to the way that people who have suffered more and think that maybe there's something else to life than just a complete frictionless engineered artificial existence. There's a kind of there's a difference between these approaches, and certainly there are many Europeans that want more air conditioning, and there are many Americans who are uncomfortable, like I am in Dallas. But there seems to be a tendency in Europe to accept that life is seasonal, and that there are times when you are cold and times when you're hot, and that you're never perfectly necessarily comfortable, except for small parts of the year when you're in tune with that season. And also that there are costs with making everything in the world human friendly, and that no matter how optimistic you are on the feats of air conditioning, there are certainly costs that come with it. And some of the costs are even intangible, like aesthetics, which I think actually matter more than some American critics count for. It would change a city like Paris to have the vents and the fans mounted on rooftops and outside of buildings and courtyards. It just would. And some people think that that's a cost that's too much to pay.
Yeah. David, so then you entered the conversation just a couple of days later after Thomas and Noah, and you wrote this New York Times essay titled, quote, "We need to retrofit the planet. The heat wave proves it." And in it, you describe what you call the transatlantic heat wave blame game. You wrote that some Europeans blamed American carbon emissions, while many Americans dismissed Europeans' reluctance to embrace air conditioning as an ideological problem, kind of a mix of like climate virtue signaling and unnecessary self-denial. And then you wrote, quote, "I find that argument maddening." What's the conversation in your view that we're not having, and what is maddening to you?
Well, I would start where Noah started, which is to say the climate is changing. The world's changing pretty fast. And I think even when we acknowledge that, when we talk about ACTs, when we talk about a lot of other stuff when it comes to climate change, we often, downplay the speed of change. And I just wanted to read a couple facts about Europe's experience of heat over the last couple of decades to put this into some perspective. I saw the other day that there have been 25 days above 30 degrees Celsius in London this year. That's about 86 Fahrenheit, 25 days this year. In the entire decade of the 80s, there were only 21. So there are more days above that heat threshold this year in London than in the entire 1980s. The number of days there at that temperature level or above has about quintupled since last decade. Until this decade, they were averaging under one of those days a year. And we're now well above that. In Barcelona, the number of those days has tripled since the 90s. In Rome, it's doubled since then. In Bordeaux, they've recorded more days above 40 C this year than in the entire 105-year-long historical record. So what we're talking about is a relatively dramatic change in the experience of high temperatures across Europe. In many ways, you could tell this story in a slightly less alarming tone by talking about the relatively gradual move upward of average temperatures. But what it means is that on extremely hot summer days, large parts of Europe are much, much hotter than they were a couple of decades ago. And the response of the continent is interesting. It's important. It's complicated. I wish that we were moving faster towards more air conditioning, especially in places where a lot of vulnerable elderly people live. But I actually think like the most important thing to note is just that the world that we are talking about adapting to in 2026 is a different world than the world in which those buildings were built, those cultures developed, those cultural mores developed, and even a different world than Europe experienced in 2003 when the continent had this kind of great awakening about the risks of heat mortality when there was a heat wave that killed tens of thousands and really started the reckoning. And since that point, Europe has done quite a lot to make itself less vulnerable to heat, not nearly to the level that most Americans experience, but they've moved quite quickly, maybe cutting their overall risk from heat vulnerability by about half. But also since that time, heat waves like the one that we got this summer have gotten 100 times more likely. And we can talk about this adaptation pretzel, the difficulty that we have responding to changing threats. We have them in the US, we have them in Europe, we have them all around the world when it comes to climate and many other things. But I think as a sort of a first principle, I would just emphasize the threat is changing. It's growing much more quickly than many people appreciate. And that means that almost no adaptive response that we mount that isn't truly dramatic is going to be adequate. And if what we're choosing between, if we're trying to debate adaptation responses that are going to seem really, really large to local populations, there are going to be plenty of people who object to that for many reasons, from political, ecological, social, and down the line. And so this problem to me seems primarily a problem of climate change, and secondarily a problem of our inability to, respond, develop the proper political economy to generate adaptive responses that can protect us in the new world that we know is coming. And, that to me, just to put a sort of even sharper point on it, for a very long time, discourse around climate change focused on the proposition that we could and should do more to avoid dramatic disruptive warming. That was much of the energy of the climate movement over the last couple of decades. In fact, for a lot of that time, people would be reluctant to talk about adaptation because they thought it distracted from the need to eliminate carbon emissions or draw down carbon emissions. And that promise was probably always a false promise. We were always going to be dealing with some amount of disruption, but we're now entering into the next act of the story, in which we have failed to avoid levels of warming, which we defined as really destructive and tumultuous. And now we're going to have to figure out ways to live in them.
Noah, I want to bring you back into this. I mean, it seems like all of you guys agree that increasing some amount of air conditioning to, at least make some truly unpleasant heat experiences with heat in some parts of Europe, fine. Go ahead and do that. So it's not much of an air conditioning debate here, guys. We're talking about other bigger things, but that's totally fine. Noah, I remember in your article, you did talk about what some politicians were saying to kind of resist the idea of even upping air conditioning. But respond a little bit to what David is saying. I mean, is this ultimately a climate change issue, or is this, we got to do anything we can to sort of reduce human suffering and if technology allows humans to flourish, that's what we got to do?
Well, I mean, obviously, we have to address climate change, because climate change is the root cause of it being hot in Europe. If we at some point reverse climate change, we can make it cool in Europe again. So you can take out your AC and enjoy your old French buildings a little bit, aesthetics a little bit more. But when you look at the numbers involved, just the amount of, if you take a reasonable climate model and you try to extrapolate the amount of warming that would be created by having every single European install AC, to the degree that Americans have AC, okay, or even more so to the degree Japanese people have AC, who have AC more than Americans actually. If you were to do that, the amount of actual warming that would be caused to the planet is essentially it's undetectable. It's it's basically zilch, and just the numbers involved are so small. There's this idea that climate change can be solved or even meaningfully addressed by localism. That is, if you can just get rich Westerners to, not take that trip on a plane flight, or, just live your life in a little lower carbon way, buy lower carbon products at the store, or things like that we can meaningfully address climate change. And we can't do that way. The sort of individual personal responsibility approach is, A, it doesn't work quantitatively, but B, I think it encourages, it focuses people on the wrong thing. What we need are policies at the governmental level, especially in countries that release a lot of carbon like China. But we need in around the world, we need policies at the governmental level that encourage the adoption of low carbon technologies, of which I would note, by the way, one is a heat pump. So a heat pump is an air conditioner combined with a heater, because as we know, an air conditioner just heats the out. It's a heater pointed at the outside of your house. Encouraging low carbon technologies at the policy level is something that will slow global warming quite a lot. And then, of course, if we want to reverse it, we're going to need carbon removal, right? Or some kind of other fancy geoengineering scheme. I don't know, but carbon removal, reverse the damage that we've done to the climate. But the most urgent priority is to stop pumping crap tons of carbon and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. And that's what we should be focused on. We need to do the things that will affect that at a quantitative level. And I think that this focus on individual responsibility, like think global, act local, is wrong. You've got to think global, act global, and so, or at least national. And so I think that this idea of, we can't use air conditioning because it hurts the climate is encouraging an approach toward climate change that ultimately won't make much of a difference to actual climate change.
David, I'd love for you to respond to that. Like, is it actually false to suggest that even if every single person in Europe had the same amount of air conditioning that the United States does, it wouldn't actually do much in terms of carbon emissions?
Well, I think in broad strokes, it's not wrong. That, this is a relatively small slice of the global carbon budget. Today, we're not, it's scheduled to grow. It will likely grow over time, but we can also do an enormous amount to decarbonize the air conditioning sector, because it's actually one of the best technologies that's most, the sequence of solar power is like lined up perfectly with our AC needs. And so even in places like Europe, where we don't have enormously abundant solar resources, it actually is relatively easy to decarbonize the electricity that we need for air conditioning. For other sectors, it's a bit more complicated. But
can you explain that a little more?
Yeah, I mean, the sun shines during the day when it's hot out. So in the summer, people want.
I do need that level of explanation, David.
So that's both the time when you need more AC and when you're getting more solar power. And one of the challenges with solar power over the last years and decades has been that it does provide this really abundant amount of basically free energy in the middle of the day in sunny parts of the world. But it's a lot trickier to spread that out over the course of days, and then especially over the course of seasons. Now, we're actually getting much better on the day level because of batteries. Batteries have meant that we can now, in many parts of the world, spread the solar power that we get so abundantly in the middle of the day into the evening and even into the night. It's a bit of a challenge to get it to spread from the summer to the winter in places like, America and Northern Europe, where there are big differences between those seasons, although I'm enough of a techno-optimist to think I think those things are coming down the line, but we're not there yet. But we are already in a place where, we could probably more quickly decarbonize our air conditioning in a place like Europe than we could decarbonize even other parts of the electricity sector in Europe, let alone heavy industry and these other things we need to decarbonize. But I would actually make I would take something that Noah said and run with it a little bit in the other direction, which is, we do have to cut our emissions to slow or stop warming. But any feasible path forward from here is going to involve more warming. The planet is going to be getting hotter over the next half century from where it is today. Now, exactly how much hotter it gets and how fast that warming happens is to some large degree a matter of human response, policy response, economic growth, et cetera. But we cannot dream in the medium term, and certainly not the short term, of a world in which we have solved climate change and can go back to the cooler climates of Europe in the 1980s or the 1970s, when, by the way, not only were carbon emissions much lower, but they had much more aerosol pollution that was actually cooling parts of the planet. And we don't want to bring that back. But that's one reason why the temperatures were so much cooler back then. So whatever we do, we're going to be dealing with a world that is more discombobulated by higher temperatures. And that's true. It's also true of wildfire. You've heard over the last couple of weeks a lot of talk about what we can do to take control of the wildfire problem in Europe and Canada and the US. in every emission scenario that anyone who is a serious person takes seriously, wildfire risk is going to get worse in each of these areas over the next few decades. And that is a fundamental conceptual framework that I think many, many more people need to appreciate, which is like even in the most radical, rapid decarbonization scenario, even in a world in which the Green New Deal is imposed by diktat from, the Secretary General in the UN and everybody abides by it. Even then, the next couple of decades will be warmer than the past few decades. And we're going to be dealing with what we now think of as anomalous heat waves, like the one that hit Europe, or the many that have hit Europe this summer, as much more regular events. So not only can we not, as Noah says, count on individual consumption choices to change the course of the planet's warming, we can't even really count on large-scale policy initiatives to bring us back to a previous, more normal seeming climate. At the very best, we are going to be dealing with a world that is quite a bit warmer than it is today, with much more punishing heat waves, much more regularly imposed on many more parts of the population.
Boy, David, you're a barrel of laughs. Thomas, let me bring you in here. Is a part of this sort of rhetorical flourish in terms of the fact that, in Europe, y'all have now been dealing with warming temperatures for quite a while. You have actually, there are examples in Spain and in other places of people sort of redesigning buildings. You're kind of reimagining work schedules and school schedules, and there are cooling centers and things like that. I mean, to a certain degree, are we sort of overblowing Europe's resistance to kind of meeting the heat wave where it is, that like when you look around, it actually, that adaptation is fully underway?
Yes and no. I mean, a lot of Europeans are living differently now than they were in 2003. That's for sure. A lot of people have these kind of these individual air conditioner units that a hose sticks out of the big, beautiful French window and just, sits in the middle of their room, and people have fans. But, I don't know. It's really interesting to me. Europeans there's a type of French person that might go and buy a bottle of like Evian that sprays out in a mist. And when they're hot and even in bed, they mist themselves. And many nights that's actually sufficient. It might not be what somebody living in Dallas, Texas would consider adequate, but outside of the extraordinary heat of the hottest days in June, that's, ça va. That's actually fine for plenty of people. They don't actually need to pump the AC until it's 68 degrees inside. There's lots of things that people do. The buildings were built for a nice cross breeze. There's cross ventilation that's already been planned into the way that these buildings were designed. Southern European cultures where it's always been hot, like in Andalusia, in Spain, they adapted by taking siestas. Americans, there's no conception that you might change the schedule of your day, or that you might actually think that there's ways to adapt to the way that nature insists on certain rhythms. We have this idea in America that we will make nature conform to our schedules. And I think that there's more resistance to that in France and in parts of Europe. I'm in a house right now there's people from Germany and Russia here. The Russians are the most anti-AC of anybody I've ever met in my life. They believe that actually you're going to get sick if you sleep. They would rather raw dog in the hot Provençal room than turn on the AC and risk getting pneumonia. So there's just very different approaches to what is comfortable or what is risky or uncomfortable outside of all of the science that both Noah and David have laid out that I am totally in agreement with. And many Europeans, many French people are bringing more air conditioning or fans or a combination of approaches into the climate crisis. But a lot of people still resist the idea that what they would like to do is just like turn the AC on to 68 degrees at all times and just live essentially within a refrigerator, which is, I think is, I use AC, but it's a deeply unappealing way to live in many ways.
It's funny you keep saying 68 degrees, like that's like this incredibly cold temperature level. I'm like,
wait, what's yours, David?
I mean, right now my AC is set to 70, but there are definitely times when I have it set below that. And I do have.
What would you have it in the winter?
Well,
you never want your place to be 68 degrees in December.
I like it cold. I mean, we've like turned off the heat in our apartment. We can't even access the knob to turn it on.
David Wallace Wells, your publication, the New York Times, sent out a newsletter saying it's okay to leave ACs running 24 hours a day. And I was like, dang, like
But
the great New York Times, like, and I straight up left my AC running that day. I'm telling you that right now.
I just want to pick up on something that
Yeah.
Thomas said a minute ago, which is, he's talking about the different sort of cultural mores or whatever, but it's also part of that story is actually anti-American distaste, which is to say a lot of Europeans are thinking, I don't want to drive a Hummer. I don't want to spend my day wandering in and out of big box stores. I don't want to jump from one incredibly air conditioned environment to another. This is an American pathology, to believe that we, not just that we can, but that we should conquer nature in this way, make it, eliminate any of the natural temperature rhythms of the outside world, and and find it distasteful on those grounds. If you could imagine some alternate history path in which everything about the world was the same, but American culture was invisible to Europeans, I don't know if they'd be, all be running to AC, but I think there'd be like a little bit less resistance to it than there is. That there is some, in the same way that Americans are like, you crazy degrowth Europeans, you can't dry your clothes in your dryer. Like in the same way the Europeans are looking at us and saying, you guys are completely insane. You want to live in an icebox and eliminate nature, when we have an incredibly nice way of life where we spend time outdoors among one another and not in these little perfectly calibrated unnatural environments.
Well, Noah, on that, let's talk about to a certain degree we're getting at the idea of sacrifice and whether as Americans we really even sit with ever thinking we need to sacrifice, right? That like if there's a piece of technology that allows us to not have to sacrifice, well, why the fuck would we ever sacrifice? Do you think that's kind of what this boils down to in many ways, and that if our carbon footprint is actually not that great with air conditioning, why would we sacrifice?
I mean, I think just framing it in terms of sacrifice is the wrong way to frame it. I think that this frame came about at a time when the technology was not in place to decarbonize our economy without severe cuts to consumption. And I think this idea was developed in the 80s and 90s and maybe the 2000s, when really, if you were going to decarbonize our economy, it would have required significant cuts to our living standards. Now, decarbonizing our economy will not require any cuts to our living standards. At the worst, it'll require temporary deferral of consumption as we shift toward investment to build solar panels and things like that, batteries. But in terms of actually how we live, decarbonizing will not make us poorer. It will actually make us richer because green energy is cheaper. It just requires, large commitment of investment, overcoming vested interests, a lot of policy coordination. And it's not true everywhere. There are places where you don't have really local supplies of wind and sun, so that even if you have batteries, you just can't necessarily produce the primary energy easily. But for the most part, in France or wherever, Italy, I don't know, most Germany, like Germany, it's just much cheaper to use green energy. It just requires a bit of a coordination problem, a bit of a change in the way we live, and it requires the political will to invest. And you've seen China absolutely muster that political will. China has this legacy coal industry that has resisted decarbonization by being very politically powerful, but even they are starting to get eroded and beaten down in China. So you're finally starting to see coal consumption peak and decline in China, even as green energy just goes off the charts. China's investing a ton, becoming what they call the world's first electro state. So China's actually succeeding at this, and it shows what you need. It's not making Chinese people poorer, right? You can decarbonize in a stupid way just by banning a lot of things and not incentivizing, and then sort of NIMBYing your way to no replacement, right? So Britain, for example, has they just banned a bunch of fossil fuels and nuclear, which is stupid, and then they just and then they had policies that didn't allow you to construct anything alternative. So British people just became poorer as a result. That's the wrong way to do it. You really can, if you incentivize new construction of solar panels and batteries, windmills and things like that, and nuclear plants, or it will not be the dominant energy source, but in niche applications, whatever, they're absolutely useful. And so, you absolutely can do this and be richer. This idea that decarbonization means wearing a hair shirt or going back to the Garden of Eden or all this stuff. This is a
like
fantasy.
doing with less. Like, so you're
Right.
saying we don't have to do with less. I mean,
No, we don't.
David, respond to that.
Right.
I think in general, in broad strokes, it's correct. There are parts of the carbon emissions pie that are a little bit more resistant to transition than others, but it happens to be the case that the power sector is just about the most ready to transition without meaningful additional cost to the average consumer. Transportation may be neck and neck with it, depending on the region. You get into some other areas that's a little trickier. Heavy industry, I think, at the moment is still more expensive to do through power by green energy. Agriculture, we don't really have great solutions for, and so a transition there might be quite difficult and expensive. But when it comes to electricity, yeah, I think the top line, which is a little misleading but is also directionally correct, is that green energy is now cheaper than any fossil fuel energy. It gets a little trickier when you're trying to design a system that will function for a whole year over a large area. But we know where we're heading. We know that where the cost curves are going, and when we make investment decisions on that basis, I think we can be pretty confident that the benefits will be much larger than the costs. Just a few years ago, there were some studies coming out that showed that even putting aside these questions, the complete decarbonization of the American electricity grid, for instance, could be entirely paid for just through the public health benefits of cleaner air from a decarbonized system, getting rid of fossil fuels, replacing them with clean energy. The benefits in terms of respiratory illness and mortality were so significant that alone, putting entirely aside the cost of energy, putting entirely aside the climate benefits, the public health benefits were enough to pay for the entire transition. Now, the question for me is that's a fact that you can cite in Senate testimony, and you can write it on your blackboard in your economics classroom, and it is true. But making it true in the real world is quite messy and tricky. And with all of these transformations and transitions, I think we get ourselves into trouble when we assume that a solution that looks neat and workable in the abstract actually meets the obstacles and interference of human lives. And that's why I started by talking about the speed of change, because it is one thing in America where we made the Southeast habitable and we made the Southwest habitable with air conditioning. Those were not regions that had large population centers. They were not able to undertake heavy industry before we air conditioned them. And so our sort of baseline is of an air conditioned environment. Not everywhere. In Seattle and parts of the upper Midwest, maybe a little bit less air conditioned, but generally speaking, the country is so widely air conditioned in part because we came to live in it through air conditioning. And it's another thing in a place like Europe where the environment is mature. The cities look as they look, and not only do they look the way they look, but the way that they look is attracting millions of tourists every year to these places, and the appreciation of locals who like living in environments that resemble the cities that their parents and grandparents and great-grandparents lived in. Now, I don't want to say that should trump all of these other considerations. If we're having 60 or 70,000 Europeans die every year from heat, that's really bad and does demand some amount of change. But effectuating that change is a political rather than technocratic matter. And I think over and over again, when we consider these questions, we kind of instinctively assume that we can design the optimal law, engineer an optimal solution without considering that people are going to be pretty resistant almost everywhere. And I would just say, to illustrate the point, I mentioned this in a piece a couple weeks ago, but in the U.S., we've just been dealing with all of this wildfire smoke in the Northeast from Canadian wildfires. There's now a lot of wildfire smoke on the West Coast because of American wildfires. And so there's been, as there is every year, sort of revival of conversation about the health risks of smoke. And there is a technocratic solution to this in part. We can make sure that every home is outfitted with really good air filtration. We can make sure that public buildings are the same way. There was a push for this during COVID when we thought it could meaningfully reduce the spread of disease as well. And we're nowhere near adequately responding, even though we are living in a society, unlike Europe, that is a little less enamored of the old ways, a little more enamored of the technocratic solution. Even in America, we have yet to really implement what we know is a pretty useful, relatively cheap adaptive response to this climatological change as well. And I think we should think about the resistance elsewhere in the world in somewhat similar terms. If we complain about how hard it is to build stuff in the US, we should have a little sympathy for people elsewhere in the world who are struggling to completely rebuild their built environment for a climate that nobody expected coming until a couple of decades ago.
Thomas, let me bring you into this because the thing that, like, as an American, it's really hard for me to wrap my head around are like the sheer number of people that die in Europe every year during these heat waves. Like that is bananas, you know, like the WHO or whoever estimates like it could be upwards of 175,000 over the last 4
I
years.
think that is a bit of an overestimate, but just to point,
what do you
I think
think it
more,
is closer to?
I mean, there's a range of ways of measuring.
Yeah.
But personally, I would say something in the range of 60 to 70 seems more robust.
Over the last 4 years.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
But even in your piece, I think, David, you were talking about there were like 1,000 in 1 week. And then in our intro, I mean, there are estimates of
the deadliest day of the of the France heat wave this June was deadlier than the deadliest day in COVID for France. I mean, that's like just in terms of total death.
Right. And so I just want to like pause on that for a second because I appreciate, you know, like joie de vivre and windows being pretty and things like that. But like, fuck, man, you have people dropping dead. Like there's something, does that, like, how does that play out in Europe? Like, do you have breaking news stories on television about it? Is it the front page? Is it like everywhere? Like if that were happening here, I would have to think, like, I don't even know what the analog is here. Is it the same? Is like gun violence and then we get that normalized?
Yeah, I think a little bit.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's really interesting. I mean, Europeans are quite perplexed by how Americans tolerate so much gratuitous gun death and don't seem to think that that requires any kind of recalibration of what they value in the abstract when they could potentially do some things, take some easy measures to safeguard some school children's lives. And Europeans consider that completely unacceptable. I mean, if you're David or Noah or yourself, your life is not at risk in Paris without AC in your apartment. It's just not. It's very risky to be elderly. It's, you know, there are some kind of alarming things that you learn that do get a lot of coverage. You know, there are maternity wards that are completely without air conditioning in all over France and Germany. That's in new hospitals that have even been built. They just didn't put in air conditioning in a maternity ward. That does seem to me to be crazy. And you had a story that really caught my eye in the French press about a bus driver. Many of the buses, the overwhelming majority of buses, even the new ones, are not with air conditioning. And so the sun beating down on the metal roof, you had a bus driver actually pass out from fainting from the heat, and he crashed the bus into a tree with passengers on it. So stuff like that
insane, Thomas.
really easy to fix without getting into larger questions of values. But I do think, I mean, I really respect the erudition of my old New America colleague, David Wallace Wells. I definitely respect the data and the kind of erudition that Noah brings, but I'm interested in the kind of fuzzier areas around which people say, yeah, maybe it is crazy that like we're losing too many elderly, but like, why are you so concerned about us on Twitter when you just absolutely live with the fact that like some amount of American school children will just get shot in school and you accept that and you barely can bring yourselves to do anything about that, and you want to lecture like, you know, the English and the Germans and the French about like whether it's like too hot in their apartment. It just does seem to me to be a strange thing, and I'm sure that there's a lot of ways to say that, well, I think Noah's response on Twitter was that this is an easier fix. I can't fix gun violence, but like I can easily show you how to fix, you know, climatisation in France. But I do think it's very interesting to dig deeper into these international perspective splits.
Let's dig. All right. I love it. Let's get in the arena. Okay, David and then Noah. David and then Noah.
When you asked Thomas a minute ago, like, how could you possibly tolerate this amount of death? I mean, I just mentioned COVID, right? In America, we were horrified when we thought that 100,000 Americans were going to die. We entered into dramatic, disruptive changes to our lives to protect that number of Americans from dying. And then when the number was 500,000 or 700,000, 900,000, 1.2 million, 1.4 million, Americans were not interested in doing much to protect one another from dying. Those are much, much, much larger numbers.
But this happens every year and has happened every year now in Europe for decades. Like, isn't that a little different than like a pandemic that, I mean, as a journalist, I was covering it every single day as a breaking news story. It was the biggest story of my lifetime, right, David?
I think there's a way in which we're watching the same story play out, which is just about normalization. Whether something happened, happens every summer or happens over the course of 2 years of an intense pandemic emergency those don't seem to me to be such sociologically different events. We have made a lot of death and suffering part of the background noise of our societies. Different cultures are more attentive to different things than one another, but all of us should be doing much more. We should be doing more to protect gun deaths in America, even if the number of children dying in schools is, relatively small, like probably under 1,000 a year. I don't know the data, but it's maybe even under 100 a year.
We should be doing accidental gun violence. I mean, accidental gun deaths.
Yeah,
crime.
Expand it more.
No. Yes.
I
mean, I don't mean to apologize for America's gun violence problem. I just mean to say, it's actually illustrative because in America, this problem and around the world, this problem does generate an enormous amount of attention, and the number of lives lost is, in the global sense, relatively small. But there are other issues where many more lives are lost much more regularly, and we pay not that much attention to them. There are reasons for that. There are reasons why the death of a child in a school is absolutely horrifying. I feel it myself. I don't mean to be diminishing it at all. But the truth is, we live in a world full of a lot of death and suffering, and we are not very good at paying attention to it or alleviating it. In part because all of these things are baked in. So, I've done a lot of writing and reporting around wildfire in the American West and in Canada. And, a few years ago, I would encounter people whose homes had burned down multiple times, who would tell me in writing about the future of fire in the West, we've always had fire here. And I would try to walk them through the numbers and say, California is now burning, 10 times as much as it was 20 years ago. The fires are much more destructive. Just last year in LA, we had these incredibly, incredibly horrifying, destructive fires, which were the second and third most destructive wildfires in California history. And those were national stories. They sparked debates about how to protect against fire, especially in California. But they also faded relatively quickly from the news. And just this past week, we had a similar event in Spokane, which was the most destructive fire in Washington state history, burned through something like 700 structures, forced the evacuation of tens of thousands, and it isn't even really making national news. So this is part of a much bigger, sociopathy, which allows all of us to stare at the thing straight in front of us, not really pay all that much attention to the bigger problems, and not necessarily feel all that motivated to change things, which is a huge problem. And one part of that problem is connected to something that Thomas was talking about a few minutes ago when he said that people like us are not all that much at risk from these threats. That is generally speaking true. We're all relatively young, relatively healthy, relatively well off. We're also relatively well informed. One hopes we have relatively good social networks where people will check in on us. One of the great tragedies of the 2003 heat wave was that families left Paris and they left their grandparents in their homes and didn't check on them for 2 weeks, and that's when they died. But it's also the case that with many public health problems, you deal with exactly this challenge, which is that the effect on any one individual life is relatively small, but the effect when multiplied over large populations is huge. Now, in America, we had an experiment about this problem with the pandemic, and the country basically decided that we freaked out too much at the beginning, and then we wanted to freak out less at the end. That is, we paid too much attention to the public health dynamic and didn't pay enough deference to the individual preference to not change much about their lives when most individuals were not meaningfully at risk. This is a deep problem across the board. Sometimes I call it the rule of small numbers in a big world. If we're worried about the effects of pollution, if we're worried about the effects of air pollution, if we're worried about the effects of heat, these are not things that are going to dramatically impinge the thriving or well-being of every single individual. In fact, most people won't meaningfully notice the difference. But if overall we're talking about 60, 70, 80,000 people dying a year in Europe, or we're talking about hundreds of thousands of Americans breathing in unhealthy air and suffering as a result, we want to be able to take some control of that. But that division, that distinction between the risk faced by the individual and the threat when calculated at the population level is really, really hard for us to wrap our head around. And especially in America, I worry that we're drifting a little bit away from the collective calculation and towards determining every policy response in terms of individual preference and individual risk. And when we do that, we're going to be doing much less to protect one another rather than much more.
Noah, let me bring you in to some of these points that they're making. In a way, is death from heat wave and normalizing it the way we normalize gun violence in this country. Like, do you see that as a 1-for-1?
I don't know, because I haven't been, I haven't been in Europe and had conversations with like regular European people who aren't, intellectuals on Twitter or immigrants to the San Francisco or something. Like I haven't talked to enough regular Europeans to know how different it is there. So I'm not necessarily the person to ask about that. But yes, like it's reasonable. It's a reasonable idea. And Americans die more often from traffic accidents, and we don't think about it much. I'd say traffic accidents are probably a better comparison than guns, actually, because gun violence, it's highly localized. You can do a lot to avoid it. Like almost no one's ever involved in a mass shooting. And then most gun violence is just like some angry kid kills another angry kid that he knows because they're angry at each other. Like that's most gun violence in America. But but car accidents are something that affect regular people and that hit us all the time. And our roads are much less safe than European roads or roads in other countries. I think they're recently became more unsafe than Russian roads.
What?
And of course that's after you normalize it for things like miles traveled and whatever. Like once you normalize for miles traveled, yes, we travel more, but actually we're dying a lot more per mile traveled. And so, but we've normalized it. We're just like, oh yeah, sometimes people die in car crashes, but that won't be me. And it's something that affects a lot of people and a lot of people's families. Unlike gun violence, which I'd say most of America is not touched by in the intellectual class. Like I've never seen a gun. I've heard a gun crime once in my neighborhood, and that was in a
But is that, Noah, are you getting at, just to kind of probe that further, the idea of normalizing it? Is it also because we all have cars and we can't, and I don't know that all of us on this call have guns, right? And so to a certain degree,
right.
the idea that we would do something to change our behavior of something we depend so much on, like, is part of this. And now I want to also bring Thomas and David in, that like, do we only want change? Like, do we actually have to sort of nudge theory our way through this, which is like make people feel like they have skin in the game? Or do we have to kind of be moralistic and like, really, it's just about policy and getting in with legislative aids? Like, do we actually need to spend time on mindset shift? Noah, let me ask you, and then I'll bring Thomas in.
I think in terms of air conditioning or in terms of roads? I mean, like absolutely
all of it. Yeah, let's start with
in
roads.
terms of roads, yes. I know Americans need to be less tolerant of their deadly roads than they are. However, in terms of air conditioning, I think Europeans probably need to be more intolerant of all their, grandparents and sick people dying and poor people dying. Yes, in my opinion, they should, but it's your business. You run your civilization, I'll run mine. If you want to have all your old people die and your grandma die and your sick people die and your like moms die giving birth and your poor people die and all this stuff, if you want that, you can be as cruel as you can for performative environmentalism or like whatever, so we don't have like fans on nice old buildings. You can do that. You can make that is your civilization's choice to make, and it's not my choice to make. But from where I'm sitting, my outside vantage point, that doesn't look like the choice I'd make. It looks pretty stupid to me.
Thomas, as somebody who wants grandmas to die, I would love you to
Definitely
respond to that.
I think you're absolutely right in phrasing it the way you did. People have to feel like they have skin in the game. I think the reason why attitudes are changing is because now the heat waves are hitting before the customary period to take your long vacation. So when heat waves would come later in the summer in July and August, people that had the most influence and the most voice in society were already in the countryside outside of Paris, and they weren't really suffering. But now in June, when it gets that hot, these people are still at work and they're still in Paris, and they're like suddenly noticing a lot of heat that maybe was there later in the summer that they weren't paying attention to or didn't care that much about. So I think that having skin in the game is actually already changing attitudes. People are saying that something has to, what David and Noah is saying is actually resonating from what I can tell in Europe, and people are saying that they will have to adapt. But, it's also, you can only do so much without larger changes. Like, I don't think I can do very much in the co-op building that I own an apartment in. I think that my neighbors have all kinds of veto power on what I might do. I can't just put mini splits in. I couldn't put anything that would have a vent in the shared courtyard. I don't know what is possible, but there's all types of ways. The Times had a fascinating article where a disabled young Frenchman whose life was at stake was trying to put air conditioning. It had been several years he'd been suing his co-op board to put air conditioning in his unit, and they consistently denied him, even when he showed medical evidence that he would greatly benefit for his specific health condition by having air conditioning. They just said, no, they can't have the sound that actually, like, units buzz and make a kind of disturbing sound as well as being ugly. So you have to actually be able to overcome all kinds of hurdles. But I think there's now an awareness that hadn't been there in previous summers because it's starting to hit so early.
David, we have as a society, I think this is happening in Europe too, quite frankly, like we have gotten behind mass public health campaigns, for instance, to make smoking something that pretty much like no one thinks is cool anymore, right? Like it's not something we really do as much as a society anymore. And I mean, to a certain degree,
that's a different example actually than what we're talking about, because if you're a lifelong smoker, your chances of lung cancer are dramatically larger. Like, it is an individual effect of individual choice. It is not something that can only be seen at the population scale. We all know people who are lifelong smokers who died of lung cancer. This is not like a difficult to process set of patterns. So it's a little bit of a different story.
Well, I guess I bring it up as, do you think it's the difference means, therefore, it is harder to get buy-in to either like technophile our way through this? That's the sort of answer that we just have to keep kind of creating technologies that will allow for an adaptation that will hopefully not make climate change worse, or that there is that sort of like collective like will we have to do something about climate change itself.
I don't think that we're going to be living in a world in which we do nothing to respond to the climate threats that we're facing. I think we're going to be living in a world in which quite a lot changes, and maybe even more changes because of adaptation response than the climate itself. But that's not to say that we're going to end up in 3 decades having completely eliminated the jaggedness of the world that warming created. We're still going to be living with more suffering from heat, from storms, from wildfire. All of those are going to intensify. And the responses that we produce are going to be haphazard and improvised, and they're going to be pressed through human bottlenecks that are not just legislative, but social and political. And therefore, they're going to be quite varied. And certain societies are going to take really seriously some risks, and other ones are going to take seriously other risks. And that's partly going to be about what they're exposed to, but it's also going to be about what's agreeable to them socially and culturally. In America, we're talking about, in this simplistic binary, we're talking about America as the technophilic end of the spectrum. Where the hell are we on EVs? We're not good with EVs.
We don't like them.
We're not racing ahead with EVs.
That's exactly right. Yeah.
And I think that problem is going to persist going forward. There are going to be ways in which, the 4 of us could get inside a room and say, okay, we expect 3 degrees of warming this century. What does that mean? We could even go down to every country and say it's going to require this amount of response in terms of wildfire protection. It's going to mean this amount of response in terms of crop resiliency, which we need to address through, genetically engineering better crops. So it's going to require this in terms of water stress. It's going to, require this in terms of illness and lost worker productivity, and we can maybe try to combat it in this way or that way. We could design a holistic system to respond to this giant world-shaping event that we are all living through. But almost certainly, the response that we do engineer in response will be partial, haphazard, and inadequate. And to the extent that it's our job to communicate and rally support and press for different, solutions, I think that it is fundamental. What you said at the top of this question, it is a matter of mind shift. The problem is that the minds are different in all parts of the world. The necessary shifts are different in all parts of the world. And it's even in a situation of an ideal communicator is delivering a completely winning message, change is still likely to be slow. There was not something that a European climate advocate in 2002 would have told you would better prepare the continent for future heat than the heat wave they saw in 2003. They went through the experience that should have woken them up, that everybody would have predicted would wake them up. And to some extent, they were awakened, but only to a certain extent. And here we are 23 years later, dealing with ever more intense heat waves and having the same kinds of conversations that we might have had 20 years ago. The continent's a bit more adapted. Vulnerability has been reduced somewhat, but we're still talking about, taking siestas in Spain and the difficulty of retrofitting homes in Paris, not because those things are trivial, but because they are difficult to overcome, and they will continue to prove difficult to overcome. Not, no matter the death toll. If the death toll were 3 million, I think it would start to get a lot easier to overcome. But because at the levels that we're talking about, tens of thousands of people losing their lives every year in a continent with 440 million, it is not that difficult to take, assessment of the risk and what needs to be done at an individual level and think you can put your own non-public health biases forward and foremost and downplay the things that you need to do for others. And I think that to the extent that we're trying to engineer a mind shift, that's the one that I'd like to see. More solidarity, more concern for the collective well-being, less focus on individual preferences, and certainly less political deference given to those preferences when they come at the expense of real human suffering.
No, that's really nicely put. And I'll say, I think there's also something here about the elderly dying. It's the same thing happened during COVID, that when people above the age of 65 are like the vast majority of the people dying, there's just something as a society, we somehow value that less than if we're other people. And I think that's something for us to consider. And I'll just say, as somebody, my family immigrated here from India, Europe is now becoming kind of how our family views India. Like, you never go to visit India in the summer because it's too freaking hot. And like Europe, you only go in the summer because like it's summer vacation, you go to Europe. But now Europe is becoming a place that like people are considering not going to in the summer because it's like,
I'm here to say I'm in the south of France right now. Come on over. It's good. There's a bunch of rosé.
You can swear it, Thomas.
I mean, it is fine.
But can I just say before we wrap?
Yeah.
It's the mention of India. It is notable that we talked this whole conversation without talking about the equator, the tropics, the developing world. Many of those countries face much larger temperature impacts than the global north, and are at this point much less prepared to deal with them. Now, they also have a lot of tools that we don't take all that seriously. They actually understand how to manage the rhythm of their days, their diet, without all that much technology.
Right.
And as a result, the threshold at which people actually start to suffer impacts of high temperatures in somewhere like Delhi is really different than in Paris, where they're unprepared. We can probably
but the
learn
pollution
something
is so
from that.
fucking bad in India. Like, that's the other part of it. It's like impossible to actually breathe there. But that's a whole other thing. We'll bring you.
But that's one reason why
Yeah.
the path of Europe here is important, because it is also important that we sort of illustrate to the extent that we can, that these challenges are manageable through policy and growth, and not that we're going to force everyone to suffer through, mass heat death
Right.
every summer when the heat wave strikes in June before everybody has gotten used to it.
I want to thank all of you guys for coming. Noah Smith, David Wallace Wells, Thomas Chatterton Williams. Thank you so much for joining us on Why Should I Trust You? Noah's going to get back to the rabbits. Noah.
Yeah, I've got to go check on Rabbit.
Oh my goodness. Do you have more than one?
No, just one, and he's old and sick, so I've got and I got.
Turn the air conditioning on for him. Go.
If it gets hot, I will. I have an air conditioning for him.
And that was Why Should I Trust You? I am Brenda Adhikari. She is Maggie Bartlett. Dr. Mark and Tom are going to be back on the next episode. Please send questions, comments to questions@whyshoulditrustyou.net, and we will see you right back here next week.